Okay, brace yourself. There was a moment in this city's history when London drank itself half to death. Not metaphorically, literally. Early 18th century, the capital is booming, swelling like a badly tied pudding. And if you're wondering, a traditional British pudding is wrapped in cloth before boiling, and if it's badly tied, it bulges and threatens to burst, which, as metaphors go, is pretty much perfect for London at this moment. Because while money was swishing around the West End, and handsome Georgian squares were rising smartly out of the mud, down in the poorer districts, places like St Giles, the wheels were coming off, spectacularly. In one notorious parish, every fifth house was a gin shop. You could get blind drunk for a penny, and the authorities began to fear, quite seriously, that the capital of the British Empire was dissolving one glass at a time. Welcome to Gin Lane. And yes, brace yourself, because this is one of the most jaw-dropping chapters in London's long, unruly life. Because into this already combustible city came cheap gin. Very cheap gin. The government, in its wisdom, had actually encouraged distilling. It helped mop up surplus grain. It boosted trade. It looked, on paper, like a thoroughly sensible idea. And then London discovered it rather liked the stuff. Liked it far too much. And the man who captured the consequences, froze them in one of the most devastating images in British art, was the great London artist William Hogarth. Now here's the thing. You can read about the gin craze. You can look at the famous engraving. But to really get it, to feel it in your bones, you want to be out there on the ground in St Giles, where it all went down. And that is precisely what former Time Out editor Ronnie Hayden's Walk does, every Wednesday afternoon at 2:30 p.m. It's called Gin Lane, William Hogarth and the Gin Craze. And it deserves to be packed to the rafters, because this story, this moment in London's history, is one of the most jaw-dropping episodes the city has ever produced. And that, in a town that gave us the Great Fire, the Blitz, and the Great Stink, is really saying something. Let's zoom in. St. Giles in the early 1700s was already on the ropes. Its streets retained an essentially medieval layout, a tight, bewildering maze of alleys and courts. The great lexicographer Samuel Johnson would later write of such neighborhoods that the houses seem ready to fall in thunder on your head. You get the picture. As wealth moved west, poorer parishes slid into a downward spiral of overcrowding, disease, and lawlessness. Lodging houses multiplied. Cellars were let out as homes. Overcrowding became a way of life. Crime followed close behind. And then came the gin. By the 1720s and 1730s, London was consuming truly heroic quantities. One contemporary estimate suggested that by 1723, the city was knocking back the equivalent of a pint of gin per person per week. Per person, not per drinker. Per person. Infants theoretically included. Distilling became, in effect, a London trade. By 1735, some 375 million gallons of spirits distilled in England were being largely consumed in the capital. Gin was everywhere, and it was dirt cheap. Hogarth himself records the famous sign outside a dram shop. Drunk for a penny. Dead drunk for tuppence. Clean straw for nothing. You hear that, and you can almost feel the floor tilt. Because this wasn't jolly tavern conviviality. This was mass social collapse in liquid form. In St. Giles, the epicenter of the madness, the statistic is almost beyond belief. Every fifth house was a gin shop. Just pause on that. Walk down any London street today and imagine every fifth doorway selling ultra-cheap, brain-blasting spirits. That was the reality London was living with, and the human cost was brutal. Contemporaries spoke of districts sinking into physical and moral ruin. The parish of St Giles became notorious for the tight clustering of poverty, alcoholism, prostitution, and crime. But it's the individual stories that really stop you in your tracks. London was horrified by the case of Judith Dufour, who allegedly killed her own child in order to sell the child's clothes for gin money. It sounds almost too grotesque to be true, but that was exactly the point Hogarth was driving home in Gin Lane. He wasn't simply being theatrical. He was holding up a savage mirror to what many Londoners believed was happening in their streets. And nowhere is that more powerfully conveyed than in the engraving's most famous detail. You know it. The mother, slumped on the steps, gin glass in hand, so far gone she doesn't notice her baby slipping from her arms and plunging headfirst towards the pavement below. It is one of the most chilling images in British art. Not melodramatic, just inevitable. And here the story darkens further still, because the gin craze wasn't just about drink. It was also about poverty, and about the increasingly severe machinery London built to manage that poverty. Enter the Georgian workhouse. In theory, workhouses offered relief. In practice, many became what one reformer called filthy, overcrowded, prison-like institutions. The regime was deliberately harsh. The thinking was simple. Make conditions severe enough, and only the truly desperate would apply. Inmates might labor for 12 hours a day, spinning yarn or making shoes. Punishments were frequent and often brutal. One Holborn workhouse record from 1732 notes a man sentenced to 24 hours in the dungeon for swearing. And then comes the statistic that really lands like a hammer blow. In 11 London parishes, of the 291 children who entered workhouses in 1763, 256 were dead by the end of 1765. Let that sink in. That is not a statistic. That is a catastrophe. Reformers such as Jonas Hanway began campaigning against these conditions. And in doing so, the story of St Giles's takes an unexpected turn outward, beyond gin shops and parish boundaries, into the wider world of empire. Because the streets around St Giles were also home to many of London's poorest black residents, sometimes referred to in the language of the day as the St Giles Blackbirds. Hanway and others became involved in schemes to relieve what contemporaries called the Black Poor. And then, just when you think this story couldn't widen any further, St Giles reaches all the way to Sierra Leone. In 1787, an ambitious and ill-fated scheme attempted to resettle former enslaved people and Lascars from London streets to West Africa. 2 ships sailed from London, carrying 441 black emigrants and their families. Many died. The experiment was not repeated. It is one of those moments when London's local story suddenly opens onto the global stage and reminds us just how entangled this city has always been with the wider world. Eventually, Parliament did move to curb the gin trade. A succession of gin acts tightened licensing and raised prices. Consumption slowly fell. London, inch by inch, stepped back from the brink. But the ghost of Gin Lane never quite disappears. Because here's the quietly extraordinary thing. You can still walk the ground. St Giles today is transformed. The rookeries are gone. The gin shops long vanished. But the street pattern, the bones of the place, is still there if you know how to read it. And that is where Ronnie Hayden comes in. Ronnie, a former Time Out editor, is one of those guides who doesn't just recite history, she animates it. She puts the flesh back on the bones. She makes you hear the clink of the gin glass, feel the press of the crowd, sense the danger that once hung in these streets. Her walk, every Wednesday at 2:30 p.m., is one of those London Walks experiences that quietly, steadily knocks people sideways. It deserves more walkers. It deserves curious Londoners, history lovers, visitors who want the city's darker, richer layers. Because this is London at full tilt, London unvarnished, London in one of its most extraordinary, alarming, unforgettable chapters. Do yourself a favor. Come and walk Gin Lane with Ronnie. London's never been more sobering.